Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, which aims to provide the information you need to know about working in the UK. So yeah, just to briefly introduce myself first. So I'm Amy Staines and I'm the Senior Financial Education Manager at Better With Money, and I am going to be presenting this afternoon. Now, just a couple of notes before I begin. So this webinar is providing information only today, so I won't be providing any sort of financial advice, but instead I'm hoping to give you the tools and the knowledge to make your own decisions about whether living and working in the UK. Also, Better With Money isn't connected to any of the companies or websites that I mentioned today, and we also have no products to sell. So if I do mention companies or websites along the way, it's because we genuinely believe they offer really, really good services which can help you and that you can take advantage of, but not because we have any sort of financial incentive to do so. And as Fiona already said, please do feel free to ask questions. We will pick these up at the end, but let's get started with the content and look at what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to start by looking at visas and BRPs first of all, before looking at opening a bank account in the UK and the key things you should be aware of around taxation as well. We'll then move on to look at state pensions, a little bit about healthcare and insurance, before finishing off with some signposting to useful resources and finishing with that Q&A. So, one of the first things you need to consider then when thinking about a move to the UK is what the UK's immigration requirements are for you and your family. And this really means getting all of your documentation in order. And this might require you to apply for a visa. So a visa is a legal status and it's a document which allows you to enter, temporarily stay, or permanently reside in the UK. So it's really, really important to get it right. And there are different types of visa available, and this depends on what you're coming into the UK to do. So just as an example, you will need what's known as a skilled worker visa if you plan on working in the UK over the long term. Now, on the topic of visas, it is worth noting that UK employers do also have responsibilities relating to visas, in that they must check certain things. So, for example, that foreign workers have the skills and the qualifications needed to do their job. They must also report to the UK Visas and Immigration Team. You might hear them referred to as UKVI, but they need to report things like if one of their workers is non-compliant with the conditions of their visa. So just something to be mindful of. But whichever visa is relevant to your specific situation, it is worthwhile starting your research early and being prepared with any necessary documentation and also understanding any associated fees in advance. And if we do think about that skilled worker visa, for example, you must have a confirmed job offer before you start that visa application, and you can apply up to 3 months before the day you start working in the UK. And it can take a number of weeks to receive that visa decision once you have applied. So again, just worth being mindful of those timelines that you're working within. Now, I have listed a couple of websites on the slide to assist with this research. So the first one is the Visa and Immigration page on the government website. This contains details of all types of work visas. It includes costs, it includes documentation requirements as well. So a really great place to start. And then the second link takes you to a really handy checker tool, and you can go on there to actually work out if you need a visa in the first place. So that's visas. But aside from visas, it's also worth understanding what a biometric residence permit, or BRP, is. Now, this is different to a visa, but it's a document issued by the Home Office which acts as evidence of the holder's immigration permissions. And you will usually get a BRP if you apply to come to the UK for longer than 6 months. And in terms of what it actually is, so it's similar in size to a credit card and it holds biographic details, so things like your name, the place and date of birth, but also biometric information as well. So that's an image of your face and your fingerprints too. And your BRP can be used as proof of your identity, but it can also be used to show your right to study, your right to any public services like the NHS. We will be talking about that more in a little while, but also any benefits too. Now, on this topic, it is worth knowing that BRP cards are set to be abolished at the end of this year, and they will be replaced by a digital solution instead. And this is going to be known as an e-visa. Details of this are still being finalised, but it is just worth keeping an eye on and just having that in mind. But in terms of getting a BRP now, you don't usually have to apply separately, but rather you will usually get one as part of your visa application. But again, something to be mindful of and to check. But that's really all I wanted to say about BRPs for now. I have linked on the slide to where you can read more, but just wanted to highlight that aside from the standard visas too. But once you've sorted your visa, once you're working in the UK, you may want to think about opening a UK bank account for your salary to be paid into. And it's not a legal requirement to have a UK bank account, but you may find that some things require you to have one. So it might be worth considering your options. And in the UK, as with many other places in the world, there are retail banks that have physical branches, but there are more and more mobile banks cropping up as well, where you actually will do all of that banking via a mobile app. And so the first thing you should think about is how you want to interact with your bank. You know, is it important that you can go into a branch and speak to someone, or actually do you prefer doing your banking digitally? And as part of this, it's also really important to consider the different types of banks and the different accounts they will offer. They often offer accounts with different features. So it's again important to consider what's important for your bank account to have. So most current accounts will come with a debit card, allow you to make and receive payments, move money, set up direct debits, standing orders. But other current accounts might have additional perks. So things like savings interest or cashback or an interest-free overdraft or free overseas spending. And there are also packaged bank accounts as well, which might also come with things like travel and mobile phone insurance. So worth thinking about, but also worth being mindful of the fact that even though bank accounts might come with enticing freebies, in reality, they might actually be covering up higher charges or monthly fees, which other accounts wouldn't have. So think about what you need from a bank account. And the Money Helper website, which I have linked on this slide, does have some really useful information on choosing the right bank account for you. So worth having a look at. But once you do know what you're looking for, that's when it's a good idea to shop around. And there are some really good comparison tools available online as well to help you choose a good bank account. And again, I've linked some of these at the bottom of the slide. But whichever bank and whichever type of account you do choose, you will more than likely need to go through an application process where that bank will want to verify your identity. Banks might want to see your passport, driving license. Some will also want to see that BRP, in which case you might need to wait until you actually arrive in the UK to complete this process. And you'll also usually have to provide proof of your UK address as well. So via a recent utility bill, for example. So again, important to have these documents to hand as part of this process. But once you've got that bank account for your salary to be paid into, it's important to understand a little about taxation in the UK. So that's what we're going to go through next. And really just to set the scene, the tax year in the UK runs between the 6th of April and the following 5th of April. And taxes are overseen mainly by His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. You may hear this referred to as HMRC. And local governments do get involved for certain taxes as well. But the slide does show the main individual taxes you are likely to come across. So I will just go through each of these in turn. And the first one is income tax. So a tax levied on your income. So that includes things like your salary, any benefits you receive, pensions, any savings interest. And if you're employed, your employer will deduct income tax from your wages every month. This is called pay as you earn. But if you're self-employed, you will need to complete a self-assessment tax return every year. And income tax in the UK is made up of different bands, and that's what you can see on the slide. So the basic rate is charged at 20%, higher rate at 40%, and additional rate at 45%. So this really means that as your income goes up, so does the amount of income tax you pay. And you'll see there that there is also the personal allowance as well. So this is the amount of income you may be able to earn without paying any tax at all. Now, the tax bands and rates are slightly different in Scotland, but you can find all of the income tax rates at the gov.uk website. But if we move on to the next one, that's national insurance, another tax that you will usually pay if you work in the UK. So, national insurance grants you access to certain benefits, and your eligibility and these benefits will depend on things like your immigration status and the length of time you've lived in the UK as well. But there are different classes of national insurance, so slightly different to income tax because they're classes rather than bands. But employees will usually fall under class 1 of national insurance, and self-employed individuals will generally pay class 2 and class 4. And unlike income tax, national insurance isn't actually an annual tax, but instead it applies to each of your pay periods. So whether you're paid weekly, monthly, or some other period. And to pay national insurance, you may need to obtain a national insurance number. And if that is the case, it is important to get this sorted as soon as you can. You might get one automatically with your BRP, but if not, I've included the link on the slide so you can apply online via that link. And there are certain instances where you don't need to pay national insurance or get a number. And these are, first of all, if you have a certificate or document that proves you pay social security contributions in the EU, Iceland, Norway, or Switzerland, or a certificate from a country that has a social security agreement with the UK. And in that case, you should check with the social security authority in your country as to how to apply for that document or certificate. So just a few things to be mindful of with national insurance, but if you do need to pay it, you will need that national insurance number. So something to think about. But the final tax you will almost certainly need to pay is council tax. And this is actually collected by your local government, and it pays for services like rubbish collection, emergency services, road maintenance. And the amount you pay depends on the value of the property you're living in and also where it's located. And again, I've included a link on the slide here, and you can visit that link to pay your council tax and also to check what band you're in terms of how much that might cost you. But as with all taxes, it's really, really important that you know what you should be paying and just make sure you are paying them correctly and on time, because the consequences of not paying the right taxes can be really significant. But you'll see that the government website is generally the best place to look for all of the information you might need. So some useful resources there to go and read a little more on tax. But on the topic of taxation, we do often get asked what happens to my overseas income if I'm now living in the UK. Now, each country does have its own rules when it comes to tax, but there may be instances where you are liable to taxation in two jurisdictions. So another important point to be mindful of. So, for example, if you're resident in the UK, but you also have a property abroad which you're renting out, that's when you might have to pay tax on the overseas rental income in both the UK and the other country. And if you fall into this category, it's important to understand a little about double taxation agreements. So this is basically where two countries try to tax the same income. But a double taxation agreement can help to limit the tax you actually have to pay. So these double tax agreements, you might hear them referred to as tax treaties, but they're drawn up between two countries. And the agreement essentially allows only one of those countries to tax your income, or it sometimes allows a credit for any tax you've already paid on that income, generally meaning that you shouldn't have to pay tax on that income twice. So it's the countries acknowledging where that income has already been taxed elsewhere. So, in some ways, a fairly straightforward concept, but in reality, situations involving overseas income can become really complicated. So, you may want to seek professional help, speak to a professional financial advisor to help you navigate situations where double taxation is involved. And if that is the case, I have linked the Money Helper website on the slide here, which has loads of really useful information about how to find a financial advisor. So, again, tax can be complicated. That does give you an overview of tax in the UK, but also a little about double taxation, but important to seek help if you're not understanding or it is becoming a little complex. And so that brings us on then to talking about pensions, and in particular the state pension, because it's important to be aware of state pensions and retirement, even if retirement is a number of years away. And that's because you build up an entitlement to the UK state pension over the course of your career. So it is a long-term planning consideration. And the state pension is separate to any private pensions or retirement savings you might hold. It's paid by the government upon reaching state pension age. And this is currently age 66, but it is due to gradually increase for those born on or after April 1960. Now, non-UK citizens living in the UK might be eligible for the UK state pension, and the amount of the state pension that you will receive is based on your UK national insurance record. So obviously we've already spoken about national insurance, and it does play into the state pension. And you need at least 10 years of UK national insurance contributions to be eligible for the state pension. So you must have paid NI for at least 10 years. Now, pensions can be another really complex area, and there may well be changes coming through as a result of the recent election in the UK. So, I guess the main thing I want to say on this slide is that you should make sure you are fully informed. And in the UK, you can get advice or information about pensions and benefits if you've previously lived abroad by contacting the International Pension Centre, which again I've linked on the slide. But you might also want to contact the pension service for your previous country as well, really to understand whether you also have any entitlement to a state pension from that country as well. But once you're armed with all of these facts, that's really when you can start planning for those longer term goals, understanding what private retirement savings you might need to build up separately to start supplementing that income later on. So that brings us on then to the final topic I'd like to talk about, which relates to healthcare and insurance, another incredibly important consideration when you are moving to the UK. So in the UK, there's the National Health Service. You may hear this referred to as the NHS, and this does provide certain services that anybody can access for free. So examples of that include accident and emergency hospital treatment and also general practitioner appointments as well. But there are certain services on which the NHS operates on a residence-based healthcare system. So this basically means that some services are only free to people who are ordinarily resident in the UK. Now, ordinarily resident is a bit of jargon, a slightly strange concept, but it's not about your nationality. It's not about national insurance contributions, but it's about living in the UK on a lawful and properly settled basis for the time being. And you will likely be asked to prove that this is the case if you do need treatment. So if you're not ordinarily resident in the UK, you will be classed as an overseas visitor, and that's when NHS services may become chargeable. So important to be aware of this and consider what it might mean for you and your family. Now, we spoke earlier about visas, and you should know that you may need to pay a charge relating to healthcare as part of your visa application. And this is called the Immigration Health Surcharge. And it becomes payable when you're staying in the UK for more than 6 months. And the exact amount of the charge will depend on the length of your visa, but it is worth knowing that there are certain situations where you might be eligible for a full or partial refund on this payment. And it's also worth being aware of the fact that this charge is payable whether you have private healthcare insurance or not. So it's payable as part of that visa application. But saying that, private health insurance is still something that many expats in the UK do choose to take out because it can help protect you and your family from day one of living in the UK if there is a bit of a delay in terms of paying that surcharge or being approved for your visa or BRP. And it also may provide access to medical care more quickly than it would be available on the NHS. So even if you have paid that immigration health surcharge, you may still want to consider looking at private health insurance options for you and your family. But I just want to finish with some places that you can go to read more about all of the things we've spoken about today. So, Money Helper covers loads of different topics on various money topics. In the UK, and it's actually backed by the Money and Pension Service of the UK government as well. So, a really useful resource. Citizens Advice has a dedicated page to immigration considerations and issues. So, again, really useful one. The Money Saving Expert contains more practical hints and tips around personal finance. So worth looking at, particularly around kind of cost of living and that sort of thing. And then finally, the gov.uk website. I've referred to this numerous times throughout the session today, but there's a really good page on visas and immigration. And from there, you can access a lot of the other pages that we have spoken about. But I also do want to use this opportunity to remind you that you have access to these resources as well. So the iSpend Fund has a 24-hour support line in case you or a family member want to talk, and they can give you free, practical and tailor-made advice on how to manage your debt and your finances. And also the support network works closely with PayPlan, who offers you and your family confidential debt and budgeting advice and solutions as well. So lots of support out there, loads of places you can go to read more. But we're kind of 7 minutes to go, and I'm very happy to open up for questions. Oh, it looks
Brilliant.
like
That's
we
yes,
have
we have
come
had a
through.
few, Amy. So let me just rattle through them if that's okay. So the first one
Sure.
we had was um it was just asking if you have a about visas, and they were just asking about what if you have a dependent visa. Does that allow you to work in the UK, and can you still seek skilled employment?
Yeah, a good question. So it's really important to be mindful that there are different types of visa for different things. And the best place for all the information around the specific types of visas is on that government website, because that really does go into a lot of detail on the specific visas and the kind of criteria associated with those. So whereas, as I mentioned, that skilled worker visa means you have to have a job in the UK when you apply. There may be circumstances where you have a visa that then allows you to seek work. So I prefer to direct you to that website for the specifics on the different types of visas, but that there is, as I say, loads of detail there around kind of specifics and the criteria attached to those. And it's really just important to make sure you are kind of following those specific criteria for the specific types of visa.
And I think that advice probably goes to the next question we had, just in relation to asking what do UK employers value more from a competitive applicant for a job? Is it the long-term commitment of people wanting a skilled worker visa, or the savings from not having to help sponsor a skilled work visa? I think probably maybe direct them again to the website.
Yeah, and I think that again will kind of vary from employer to employer. And as I mentioned earlier, employers do have their own kind of responsibilities when it comes to hiring individuals who are on visas. It's really important that kind of both parties are getting it right. So aside from the gov.uk website, which goes into details about all the specific types of visa, again, if there's a particular employer, worth having a chat with them, because if it's a UK based employer, it might be slightly different to whether it's a more global employer. Quite quite nuanced and quite specific, I'd say, in some of these situations that will depend on the particular role, the particular visa, the particular employer. So yeah, probably worth reaching out to them kind of specifically and asking that question as well.
Super. And then another question, what happens with any money I put into the state pension through my national insurance contributions if we leave the UK permanently before the 10 years of working here?
That's a really good question, and probably one I would want to take away. I'd off the top of my head, as I said on the slide, you do need that 10 years to be eligible. But there are rules around eligibility and the fact that you might be able to boost your eligibility with social security contributions you've paid elsewhere. But if you move away from the UK, I'd probably just want to take that away just to see what that actually meant in practice, based on the national insurance contributions you have paid. And it's also worth noting as well that national insurance isn't just about the state pension. It's also about, as I said, benefits. And there are a few other kind of areas as well that national insurance does contribute towards. So it will be payable regardless of whether you end up taking the state pension, but probably one that I will kind of take away and come back on if that's okay.
Absolutely fantastic. If my family dependent members do not work, are they needed to pay national insurance in the UK?
Generally, you only start paying national insurance when you earn above a certain threshold. So likelihood is no. There are kind of minimum thresholds for paying that. Saying that, sometimes there are cases where it is beneficial to make national insurance contributions, even if you're not working. And that is really so you can access some of those certain benefits. And you can read a lot more on that on the national insurance page that I did link on the slide, kind of what those minimum thresholds are, because there are, for example, as I say, benefits that are linked to national insurance contributions. So perhaps even if you're not working, it may be sensible to consider making some contributions to kind of make you eligible for that. So worth checking out that national insurance page on the government website. But generally, no, if you earn below a certain threshold, you don't pay national insurance. But as I say, there are cases where it might be worthwhile making voluntary contributions instead.
Excellent, thank you. Um, how often can someone switch bank accounts before it negatively impacts things like credit rating?
Yeah, a good question, and it's actually something that's really important to be mindful of. So it's probably worth me just saying a little about credit ratings first. So it's not the case everywhere, but in the UK, to be able to borrow money, you do generally need a good credit score. So your credit score essentially provides a snapshot of your credit worthiness or how good you are at managing credit day to day. And the credit reference agencies in the UK, so they're Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, they do start to build a credit history of our financial transactions when we get to age 18. And that's to help lenders get a good feel for whether we're kind of good bets to lend to. So your credit score is really important, particularly if you're hoping to get a mortgage or take out a loan. So really, really important to be kind of mindful of. And just as there are things you can do to improve your credit score, there are also things you should be aware of that can have a negative impact on your credit score, which I guess then brings us back to that question, because opening bank accounts with a new bank is one of those things that can impact your credit score. Because when you do open a new bank account in the UK, your bank will look at your credit report and they will either perform what's known as a soft check or a hard check. And different banks will take slightly different approaches. But soft checks won't show up on your credit score. They won't have an impact on that. But most banks will do a hard check. So they will show up on your credit report. You will know if they're going to do a hard check. They will tell you and make sure you're happy with that. But it does mean that it's important to remember that opening bank accounts and switching bank accounts can impact that. So particularly if you're considering taking out a mortgage or taking out a loan, probably not a good idea to switch accounts or open lots of accounts in a short period of time prior to that. But there isn't a kind of hard and fast rule, but just something to be aware of, really. So hopefully that answers that question.